Welcome to Murder on the Bonfire Night, a Miss Marple Mystery. A peaceful village, a roaring bonfire, and when the flames die, a body is found. Who lit the fire, and who wanted it to burn? Where are you listening from? Tell us in the comments below. Let's begin. The village of Little Brenton prided itself on its sense of tradition, and nothing symbolized that more than its annual bonfire night. Every November the 5th, the villagers gathered on the green to roast chestnuts, drink mulled cider, and watch the effigy of Guy Fawkes burn under a shower of sparks. Children shrieked with excitement, old Mr. Pottle played his concertina by the fire, and the vicar gave a little speech about the dangers of treason and fireworks in equal measure. This year promised to be especially grand. The weather had held miraculously fine, and the air was crisp and still, with just a hint of smoke from early bonfires in neighboring parishes. The enormous pile of timber and brushwood had been assembled over the past week under the direction of Mr. Alfred Hargreaves, the chairman of the parish council, a man whose sense of order verged on tyranny. His wife, Cynthia, bustled about in her fur stole, managing the stalls and scolding the scouts for getting mud on her tablecloths. From her neat little garden gate across the lane, Miss Marple observed the preparations with mild amusement. She had already contributed 2 jars of her damson jam to the refreshments table and a bundle of dry twigs to the bonfire. Her cat, Wellington, purred sleepily on the windowsill, indifferent to the fuss outside. "It's all quite as it was when I was a girl," she remarked to herself, threading her knitting needles. "Except perhaps there's more arguing about who gets to light the bonfire." Indeed, arguments had been plentiful. Mr. Hargreaves had forbidden the participation of young Dennis Clay, the gamekeeper's son, who had been caught last year smuggling fireworks and nearly set fire to the school fence. Dennis, a broad-shouldered youth with a temper to match, had not taken the exclusion kindly. Rumor had it he'd sworn revenge on the pompous chairman. At dusk, the villagers began to arrive wrapped in scarves, carrying lanterns, and stamping the cold from their boots. The great bonfire towered dark and silent against the twilight, waiting for the spark that would set it ablaze. Miss Marple joined Mrs. Price Ridley and the vicar's wife, Mrs. Anstruther, near the edge of the green, politely declining a paper cup of cider. "Quite a crowd this year," said Mrs. Price Ridley, narrowing her sharp eyes. "I dare say the Hargreaveses are pleased with themselves." "Mrs. Hargreaves does enjoy being in charge," Miss Marple said gently. "Though I always think managing people is like stirring porridge. You mustn't let it stick, or it turns bitter." Mrs. Price Ridley gave her a puzzled look, uncertain whether that was criticism or philosophy. The vicar made his speech, the scouts cheered, and Mr. Hargreaves stepped forward proudly with a long taper. The crowd murmured in anticipation as he bent toward the kindling when a sudden gust of wind snatched the flame and extinguished it. There was laughter, good-natured at first, but as he tried again, a shout rose from the back of the crowd. "Mind your powder, Alfred, you'll blow yourself up." Laughter again, but Mr. Hargreaves stiffened, recognizing the voice of young Dennis. The 2 men locked eyes across the crowd, the moment hanging heavy before the chairman turned away, face red in the firelight. He struck the match again, and this time the wood caught. The flames leapt high, crackling and roaring as the effigy of Guy Fawkes began to burn. The crowd cheered, children waved sparklers, and the band struck up "Rule, Britannia." It was a perfect village celebration until the screaming started. It came from the far side of the bonfire, near the shadowy hedgerow. Several people turned, uncertain whether it was excitement or distress. Then the screaming grew louder, piercing, hysterical. The music faltered. A young woman, Elsie Carter, the postmistress, stumbled into the firelight, her face white as chalk. "There's someone in there," she gasped, pointing toward the blaze. Inside the bonfire, a horrified silence fell. For a moment, no one moved. Then several men rushed forward, trying to drag away the outer branches. But the fire was already roaring fiercely. the heat driving them back. Sparks flew upward like 1,000 fireflies, carried away into the cold black sky. Miss Marple stood very still, her knitting needles forgotten. She felt a strange chill, as though the laughter and warmth of the evening had been snatched away. It was Mr. Hargreaves himself who shouted, "Water! Get the pump! Quickly!" Within minutes, the great pile had collapsed inward, the effigy and whatever lay beneath it consumed in a roaring inferno. When at last the fire was reduced to glowing embers, the truth became horribly clear. Beneath the charred remains of wood and straw lay the unmistakable outline of a human body. Cynthia Hargreaves fainted. The vicar crossed himself, and Miss Marple, very quietly, said to no one in particular, "Someone made certain Guy Fawkes wasn't the only one burned tonight." The murmurs began immediately, names whispered. Suspicions kindled as quickly as the flames that had devoured the victim. Some said it must have been Dennis Clay's revenge. Others swore it was a dreadful accident. But Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, sharp as ever, saw something else. Something not quite right about the way the wood had been stacked and how Mr. Hargreaves's taper had flared at just the wrong time. In Little Brenton, the bonfire's smoke would linger for days. So too would the secrets it had burned to the surface. The next morning, a pale fog hung over Little Brenton, clinging to the hedges and drifting through the lanes like smoke that refused to die. The bonfire's ashes still smouldered faintly on the village green, cordoned off now with a line of rope and 2 constables who stamped their feet against the chill. News had travelled swiftly, faster than any post. By breakfast, every household knew. Someone had been burned to death during the festivities. Miss Marple, pouring her tea at her lace-covered table, could hear the hum of speculation even through her garden hedge. The milkman, who prided himself on being first with every morsel of gossip, had already told her that the police believed the victim to be a man. "Could be Mr. Hargreaves himself, ma'am," he'd whispered dramatically. "Didn't go home last night, they say." Miss Marple had only smiled faintly. "Or it might be that he preferred to avoid the unpleasantness," she'd replied. But her eyes lingered on the faint plume of smoke still visible beyond the green. By mid-morning, the heart of Little Brenton was abuzz. Outside the post office, Mrs. Price Ridley, Mrs. Anstruther, and the butcher's wife formed an anxious semicircle around Elsie Carter, who was pale but visibly thrilled by the attention. "I saw the boot, clear as anything," Elsie insisted. "It weren't Guy Fawkes that one had a red stocking. This was a black leather boot, sticking out from the logs." "Good heavens," breathed Mrs. Anstruther, clutching her pearls. "And to think, all the children laughing and clapping while that poor soul was burning. Poetic justice, I call it," sniffed Mrs. Price Ridley. "If it was that young Dennis Clay, always in trouble, always skulking about, mark my words, it's the sort of end that comes to those who mock authority." "But what if it wasn't Dennis?" whispered Elsie. What if it was someone important?" At that precise moment, the sound of boots on gravel silenced the group. Inspector Graves, a solid, ruddy-faced man with a habit of chewing on his pencil, strode toward them, followed by a younger constable carrying a notebook. "Ladies," he said curtly, "you'll do yourselves no good standing about speculating. The body's not yet identified, so best you all go home and leave the business to us." The women scattered reluctantly, muttering as they went. Only Miss Marple, who had been passing on her way to the grocer's, paused to offer the inspector a polite smile. "Such a dreadful business," she said softly. "Though I suppose in your work one must grow rather used to dreadful things." "Morning, Miss Marple," said Graves with a respectful nod. "I can't say I'll ever get used to 'em, ma'am, but this one's a nasty piece. Someone went to trouble to put that body in there before the lighting, and whoever it was, they didn't mean it to be found." "How very curious," she murmured. "It must have been done before dusk, And yet no one noticed? Though of course people rarely notice what's right in front of them when there's excitement in the air. The inspector looked at her with faint amusement. You've a sharp eye for these things, Miss Marple, but I don't suppose you saw anything unusual yourself last night. Oh, nothing one could call unusual, she replied mildly. Only that, Mr. Hargreaves seemed preoccupied, not quite himself. And young Dennis Clay, well, anger makes people loud, doesn't it? But guilt makes them quiet. I wonder which he'll be today. The inspector frowned slightly, not sure how to take that, but before he could reply, a shout came from the green. One of the constables was waving frantically. A crowd gathered again as Graves hurried over. Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance. The constable pointed to a small blackened shape just beyond the rope, a pocket watch. Its metal case warped from heat. The inspector pried it open carefully with his pencil. Inside, barely legible, was an engraving. A.H. There was a collective intake of breath. Mrs. Hargreaves, who had just arrived in her fur coat, gave a strangled cry and swayed on her feet. It's Alfred's, she sobbed. His father gave it to him when he turned 21. Oh God, Alfred. Miss Marple's hands tightened slightly on her shopping basket. So the victim was indeed the pompous, proud, and very public-minded Mr. Hargreaves. The man who had built the bonfire, lit it, and, as it turned out, burned within it. Yet something about it troubled her deeply. If Alfred Hargreaves had been there, why had no one seen him after lighting the fire? And how had his body been placed so neatly in the center without anyone noticing? The inspector turned to the crowd, his voice firm. That's enough. Everyone clear off. We'll be speaking to you all soon enough. As the villagers dispersed in uneasy silence, Miss Marple lingered, watching the inspector's men collect the evidence. In the distance, she saw young Dennis Clay standing by the hedge, his face pale, his fists clenched. He met her gaze for a moment, then turned sharply and walked away. Miss Marple, who knew the signs of a soul in torment as surely as she knew the symptoms of mildew in her roses, sighed softly. There are worse things than guilt, she murmured. There's fear. And as the fog thickened over the village green, she knew that both were about to make themselves very much at home in Little Brenton. Inspector Graves took the Memorial Hall reading room and by noon had 2 constables and a folding table. Miss Marple did not join the queue. She walked the green, noting the scorched oval where the bonfire had settled, the muddy runnels toward the refreshment stall, and tatters of yellow streamer snagged along the hedge. Cynthia Hargreaves had taken refuge at the vicarage. She sat straight, cup untouched. How dreadful for you, my dear, Miss Marple said. Shock is an unkind tailor. Alfred lived for this village, Cynthia answered, to be burned like rubbish. They say they found his watch. Chains are sociable, Miss Marple murmured. They catch on what's nearby. We dined at 6, Cynthia said. He left at past to fuss about the kindling. I saw him everywhere before the lighting. After, I don't know. People say he was inside all along. People say what eases fear, Miss Marple replied. Had he other quarrels than young Dennis? Anonymous letters about parish funds, Cynthia said. He laughed at them. The maid admitted Elsie Carter, bonnet crooked, cheeks flushed. Mrs. Hargreaves' inspector sent me. They found the rest of Mr. Hargreaves's watch chain behind the cider stall. Cynthia flinched. Behind the stall? Why would he be there? Larry Baker helped me with barrels, Elsie said. He tied streamers, too. I left only a minute to look for my gloves. Gloves are notorious runaways, Miss Marple said. Did you find them? In my apron, Elsie confessed. I'd had them all along. Miss Marple crossed to the hall. Inside, Inspector Graves stood over a billiard table, turned to a map, pins pricking colored lines. You've identified him? She asked. Near enough, he said. Boots, height, the watch. Doctor, tonight. It's ugly. Whoever did this had time. And the fire helped. Fires oblige villains, Miss Marple said. Your lines? Opportunity and grievance, Graves replied. Dennis Clay had both. He shouted, then slipped away. Claims he smoked by the hedge. Alone? So he says. She plucked a tatty streamer from his sleeve and laid it down. These catch. A sleeve, a chain, a thought. Where was Larry Baker when he tied them? Along the hedge, Graves said, checking his notebook. Good worker. The garage vouches for him. Good workers are often used. She said mildly. Did the effigy wear a hat? A floppy felt thing, Graves said. It fell once, the children squealed. Hats fall when lines are tugged, Miss Marple observed. Crowds look at hats, not hands. She walked the hedgerow. The grass showed grey crumbs that glittered when the cloud thinned. She rubbed one between finger and thumb. Mica. Fireworks, shy confetti. Farther on lay a fused bit of thin cord. She pictured a line from hedge to effigy, a tug and tumble to draw 100 eyes for 5 forgiving seconds. By the gate stood Dennis Clay, shoulders hunched. He straightened. I didn't do it, miss. I swore and shouted. But I didn't do this. I am listening, she said. I was at the hedge, he said, smoking. Larry walked past twice with string and paper. Said Mr. Hargreaves wanted festive. He looked worried like Dad's ferret when the collar's loose. What time? Near 7. Then just before the lighting. Thank you, Miss Marple said. Anger shouts, fear tidies. Which was Larry? Tidying, Dennis said, after a moment, and watching Mr. Hargreaves like a rabbit watches a dog. Miss Marple returned to the lane. The day had sharpened. She paused at a narrowing and found a smear on a fence post, a black greasy trace. She scraped it free. Pitch and wax. A torch or a treated taper to move safely within a stack. At her gate, Wellington blinked a grave welcome. Miss Marple looked toward the green, where the inspector's men moved like beads on invisible thread. The hat, the chain, the streamers, the fireworks' faint kiss upon the grass last night had been arranged with the neatness of a house-proud burglar. She did not yet know the motive, but she recognized the temperament. Neat people rarely plan only once. She went in to telephone the hall and ask whether Inspector Graves might have a quiet word with Larry Baker before tea. Very quietly, Inspector Graves arrived at the smithy before tea, his boots crunching over the gravel, and found Larry Baker polishing a length of brass piping with a rag. The man's shoulders were broad and his face ruddy, the sort that smiled easily but watched too closely when spoken to. Graves began with the formalities: name, occupation, whereabouts during the bonfire, but Larry answered in that careful way men do when they've rehearsed every syllable. Carried boards for the stage, sir, he said. Helped Elsie with the barrels, then stood with the others to watch the lighting. You didn't go near the bonfire once it was lit? Not I, sir. Too hot for my liking. Graves looked around the shed. Coils of wire hung from the beams, tins of varnish stacked neatly, everything in its place. Too neatly. You worked with fireworks last year, didn't you? Larry hesitated. A bit. The vicar asked me to fix a few fuses. Ever use tar or pitch? For lantern posts, Larry said. Why? Graves didn't answer. His pencil scratched something down. Stay near home. We may have more questions. When he left, Larry stood by the door, wiping his hands again and again on the same rag, though they were already clean. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had been in her garden pruning the frost-bitten roses when Dennis Clay appeared at her gate. His cap was in his hands. Inspector's talkin' to Larry, he said. They'll twist it all round to me after. He hates me. Who does, dear? Larry, Dennis muttered. He's been after me ever since Dad lost his job at the estate. Says we cost him work. He's sly, miss. Smiles for everyone, but I've seen him watch people like a cat behind a fence. Miss Marple studied him quietly. Slyness is a lonely occupation, Dennis. It feeds on company but never trusts it. Tell me, did you see Mr. Hargreaves last night after the bonfire court? He shook his head. No, ma'am. to the cider stall. Larry went that way too, carrying a stick with a lantern on it. I remember the glow on his face. "That's very observant," Miss Marple said. "Thank you, dear. You should have some warm milk before bed tonight. Anger unsettles the stomach." Dennis managed a weak grin and left. That evening, the fog thickened once more, rolling through the lanes like a living thing. Miss Marple, seated by her fire, took out her knitting and considered the threads not of wool, but of human nature. A quarrel, a bonfire, an unseen act in the dark. Mr. Hargreaves had been pompous, yes, but not cruel. And yet someone had risked a public murder to destroy him. That sort of boldness rarely sprang from anger alone. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock. It was Inspector Graves. Looking weary but alert. "You were right, Miss Marple. There's pitch on what's left of Hargreaves's clothes, and something else, bits of string tied under his coat, as if to drag or position him. You wouldn't know what to make of that, would you?" She smiled faintly. "Perhaps. Did the string match the bunting used around the stalls?" He blinked. "It did, as a matter of fact. How did you—" "Human beings are thrifty, Inspector. They use what's nearest. Someone who helped with the decorations would have had such cord ready. Someone like Mr. Baker, perhaps." Graves rubbed his chin. "He claims he left before the lighting. We'll see. I've sent for him again in the morning." After he left, Miss Marple sat a long time, listening to the clock tick. She thought of Larry's workshop, all in order, every tool in its place. A man who liked control. A man who might think himself clever enough to tidy even a murder into neatness. The next morning dawned raw and grey. Villagers passed in whispers. The funeral bell had not yet tolled, but mourning had already begun. Elsie Carter avoided the green entirely, her eyes red. Miss Marple found her outside, the post office, struggling with a crate. "Poor Mrs. Hargreaves," Elsie said tremulously. "She's gone to her sister's. Couldn't bear to stay." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple said. "And Mr. Baker? Have you seen him today?" Elsie hesitated, glancing toward the smithy. "He came by early, before breakfast. Asked if I'd posted any letters for Mr. Hargreaves lately. I told him no." He looked relieved. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her mind sharpened. A man concerned with letters, after a death involving parish accounts and anonymous notes, that was a thread worth pulling. As she walked back toward her cottage, she saw Larry himself crossing the green, a small parcel under his arm. When he noticed her watching, he touched his cap with an oddly forced politeness, then turned down the lane that led to the abandoned quarry. Miss Marple paused at her gate, eyes following him until he disappeared into the mist. She sighed softly. "Yes," she murmured to Wellington. "I think, my dear, that we may soon see what he meant to bury besides poor Mr. Hargreaves." The mist lay thick over the fields beyond Little Brenton as Miss Marple followed the narrow path toward the old quarry, her walking stick tapping lightly on the stones. It was a foolish thing to do, she told herself, tramping about alone at her age, but she had long since learned that certain matters would not wait upon convenience. Larry Baker's parcel, the peculiar timing of his errand, and his questions about the letters all pointed toward something he wanted hidden before the police could find it. And if there was one thing Miss Marple understood, it was the human need to tidy away guilt before breakfast. The quarry itself was a bleak hollow, long abandoned and half filled with stagnant water. The gorse along its rim grew thick, and the ground was littered with old timbers and rusted nails from when it had once served as a dumping place for broken timber carts. Miss Marple walked slowly, scanning the earth. She did not have to search long. Near the old footbridge, she found a patch of freshly disturbed soil, narrow but deep. She knelt carefully, brushing the surface with her gloved hand, and soon uncovered the corner of a small, oilcloth-wrapped package. She was still contemplating whether to open it when a voice behind her made her start. "Well now, that's private property, that is." Larry Baker stepped from the fog, his broad frame blocking what little light filtered through. He still held the same parcel, or rather, its twin under his arm, the edges damp with dew. His eyes flicked to the hole she had uncovered, then back to her face. "I was looking for something I thought might have been lost," Miss Marple said pleasantly, rising with surprising steadiness. "It seems I was right." Larry's jaw tightened. "You've no right to poke about out here. You and that inspector always looking to make something of nothing." "I rarely make something of nothing," Miss Marple replied mildly. "I prefer to notice when something doesn't fit where it ought, like a man carrying 2 parcels when he only left home with 1. He stared at her for a moment, then gave a short, humorless laugh. "You've got imagination, miss. Perhaps you should tell your stories to the constable instead." "I imagine I shall," she said quietly. Larry took a step closer, the fog curling about his boots. "You think you're clever, don't you? Old ladies always do. Always watching, always gossiping. But you don't understand men like me." "Oh, on the contrary," Miss Marple said, her voice calm. "Men like you are quite common in villages. Hard-working, careful, proud of order. You take on more than you should because you believe you're the only one who can do things properly. And when someone threatens that order, someone like Mr. Hargreaves, perhaps you panic." He blinked, startled. "Panic? You were helping with the bonfire. You saw him arguing with young Dennis and perhaps decided to calm things by rearranging the kindling, only later realizing he'd fallen or struck his head. It was dark, the fire ready to be lit, the crowd coming. So tidy, man that you are, you hid him where you thought no one would look inside the pile itself." Larry's face drained of color. "That's lies. I didn't. He was already dead when I found him." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "I rather thought so. But you did nothing to stop what followed, did you? You told yourself you were only sparing his wife shame. You even buried his papers this morning to protect her. That's what's in your parcel, isn't it? The letters about the missing parish funds." For a long moment he said nothing. Then his shoulders sagged, and he gave a weary sigh. "He'd been stealing," Larry muttered. "Not much, but enough to make trouble if the council found out. He begged me to keep quiet. Then last night he stumbled against the firewood, hit his head on the spade, dead before I could shout. I thought I could save him, or at least his name." "You might have saved him better by telling the truth," Miss Marple said gently. Before he could reply, voices echoed through the fog, Inspector Graves and his men approaching. Larry looked from Miss Marple to the path and back again, then dropped the parcel into her hands. "You tell him," he said hoarsely. "You've got the words for it." And without another glance, he walked toward the inspector, his figure swallowed by the grey air. Miss Marple stood a moment longer, the parcel cold and heavy in her grasp. Inside, she could feel the shape of folded paper, stiffened with damp. As the voices drew nearer, she turned toward them, her face grave. "Poor man," she murmured. "He only wanted to clean up a mess." "But tidy minds," she added softly, "so often make the worst of grind. Housekeepers when it comes to conscience." Inspector Graves reached Miss Marple just as she emerged from the fog with the damp parcel in her hands. He was breathing hard, his coat collar turned up against the cold, and 2 constables trailed behind him with their lanterns swinging. Larry Baker stood a little apart on the path, shoulders slumped, head bowed. Miss Marple handed Graves the bundle without a word. He unwrapped it, revealing several letters, their edges blackened and smeared with wax. The inspector turned one over and read aloud the neat, slanted handwriting. "To Alfred Hargreaves, Parish Council, regarding the discrepancy in funds." He stopped, frowning. "Anonymous, of course." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "though I rather think the writer intended to frighten rather than expose him. Someone who knew the truth, but preferred shadows to confrontation." Graves grunted. "And Baker admits to hiding these?" "Reluctantly," Miss Marple replied. "He found Mr. Hargreaves after the accident, or what he believed was an accident, and sought to protect the man's name. But there's something he hasn't realized yet. Graves raised a brow. Which is that Alfred Hargreaves wasn't dead when he was placed in the bonfire. The inspector stared at her. Good Lord, what makes you say that? Simple logic, Miss Marple said. The pitch found on his clothing wasn't merely spilled, it was spread. A crude preservative to mask the smell of spirits. And the watch, engraved and left so conveniently near the scene, was meant to ensure we believed he was there all along. Someone arranged it all before the lighting, but the man himself must have been unconscious, not dead. Otherwise, there'd have been no reason to hide him so carefully. A corpse doesn't need disguising, Inspector. Only disposal, Graves swore under his breath. Then Baker didn't kill him. No, she said quietly. But someone used Baker's panic to cover their own misdeed. Someone who knew he'd find the body and tidy it away for them. I dare say that someone even helped spread the story that Dennis Clay had quarreled with Hargreaves. It's a convenient distraction. Graves frowned. Who would have known both about the funds and Baker's temperament? Miss Marple's blue eyes turned toward the green. Someone who handles letters, Inspector. Someone with access to the council post and the means to write anonymous ones. It took him a moment. Then his expression hardened. Elsie Carter. Miss Marple nodded slightly. She's a kind girl, but too fond of being important in other people's secrets. Mr. Hargreaves dismissed her last spring over a misdelivered notice, though he made her return afterward. She might have wished to humble him, but I fear it went rather beyond that. They reached the village again just as dusk began to fall. A thin drizzle had started, turning the cobblestones slick. Elsie was closing up the post office, her hair tucked under a scarf. When she saw the inspector, her face went pale. Evening, Miss Carter, Graves said evenly. We'd like a word about these letters. Her hands trembled as she reached for the latch. I don't know what you mean. I didn't write anything. Then you won't mind us looking through the outgoing post, he said, stepping past her. Miss Marple watched in silence as Graves opened the drawer and drew out a small stack of envelopes, all addressed in the same tidy hand. One of them, half sealed, bore Cynthia Hargreaves's name. Inside was a folded sheet with only a few words written. Your husband was not what you think. Ask the blacksmith about the bonfire. Elsie gave a strangled sob. I only meant to frighten her. I thought she should know. He'd been stealing, everyone knew it, and he laughed at me when I tried to warn him. Said no one would believe a silly girl at the post office. Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. So you came to the Green early, didn't you, my dear? You went to confront him. And when he refused to listen, you struck him with the lantern pole you'd been carrying for decoration. You thought you'd only knocked him out. Elsie's eyes filled with tears. He fell, he wasn't moving, and then Larry came. I ran before he saw me. And he found Hargreaves, and thought he'd stumbled into a tragedy of his own making. Miss Marple finished softly. You see, my dear, lies have a dreadful habit of tidying themselves into truth if left unchecked. The girl broke down then, and the inspector led her away, his expression grim. When they were gone, Miss Marple lingered outside the post office, her gaze drifting toward the darkened green where the bonfire had once blazed. The ashes were cool now, but a faint curl of smoke still rose into the damp evening air. She sighed. So much heat, she murmured, and so little light. Tucking her scarf closer around her throat, she turned and walked slowly home through the mist, already hearing the quiet purr of Wellington waiting by the fire. The following morning dawned clear and brittle, the kind of November light that seemed to expose every imperfection. Yet, for all that clarity, little Brenton felt clouded with unease. The post office remained shuttered, its notice board empty, and the villagers spoke in hushed tones as they passed. Rumor had already transformed the sad tale into something grander: poison, revenge, secret love affairs. But Miss Marple knew that gossip always outpaced truth. She also knew, as she sat by her window with her knitting untouched, that something still tugged at the edges of the case. A thread left unresolved. It was not sympathy for Elsie Carter that troubled her, though the girl's tears had been genuine. No, it was something smaller, subtler, the way Inspector Graves had accepted her confession with such finality, as though the matter were neatly bound and shelved. But Miss Marple had learned, through years of church fetes and village feuds, that tidy endings were often contrived ones. She replayed each scene in her mind, the letters, the quarrel, the bonfire, and the curious placement of the body. None of it quite fit. At 11 o'clock, a knock came at her door. It was Mrs. Anstruther, pale and breathless, her hat askew. "Miss Marple, have you heard? The inspector's released that poor girl. He says there's no proof she struck the blow. And what's worse, Mr. Baker's vanished." "Vanished?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "Gone before dawn. Left the smithy open and his tools still warm. They say he was seen taking the London road." Miss Marple rose at once, fetched her coat, and said only, "Then I fear the inspector's tidy shelf is about to collapse." She found Inspector Graves at the vicarage, conferring with the constable over a half-eaten breakfast. His face darkened when he saw her. "You've heard, I suppose?" Baker's bolted. The girl swore he frightened her into silence, said he'd been blackmailing Hargreaves over those letters. "We found £10 in his workshop drawer." Miss Marple regarded him gently. "And that, to your mind, proves him guilty?" "Guilty enough," Graves said. "It was hush money. Hargreaves paid him to keep quiet, and when the money ran out, Baker took matters into his own hands. Or perhaps," she said quietly, "someone wanted it to appear that way. Forgive me, Inspector, but I cannot reconcile the man I spoke with yesterday, the one who could barely meet my eyes, with a calculating blackmailer." Graves frowned. "You think someone planted the money? Possibly. And I believe the truth lies in what was missing, not what was found." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "And what's missing this time?" "The second parcel," Miss Marple said. "You recall, he carried 2 at the quarry. I handed you one, but the other he still had it when you arrived. He must have hidden it before he surrendered." The inspector straightened. "Hidden it where?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the church tower, visible through the window. "If he meant to prove his innocence, somewhere safe, somewhere consecrated." Half an hour later, they stood inside Luke's church. The air was cool and smelled faintly of wax and stone dust. Miss Marple's eyes swept the nave, settling on the pulpit's carved base, where a small section of paneling sat uneven. She bent, slipped a knitting needle into the gap, and pried it gently open. Inside lay the missing parcel, still wrapped in oilcloth. Graves unfolded it carefully. Out slid a ledger, its pages crisp despite the damp, filled with tidy columns of numbers, and beneath it, a single letter addressed to Inspector Graves. The inspector read aloud, his voice low. "If you find this, I am gone to clear my name." The money was planted. "Ask Mrs. Hargreaves about the accounts. She knew everything. I only meant to frighten her into speaking." He exhaled sharply. "Good Lord." Miss Marple's expression softened. "Mrs. Hargreaves," she murmured. "A woman who faints at the right moment, who weeps on cue, and who, by all accounts, handled her husband's correspondence. A clever woman indeed." Graves looked stricken. "You think she?" "I think she discovered her husband's theft long before anyone else," Miss Marple said gently. "And when he refused to stop, she arranged the perfect solution, an accident with a scapegoat. She needed the letters to justify her grief, the girl to take the blame, and the blacksmith to vanish beneath suspicion." The inspector stared down at the ledger, his jaw tight. "We'll bring her in." Miss Marple laid a hand on his arm. "Go gently, Inspector. She will not resist. Women like Mrs. Hargreaves rarely do. They commit their crimes not out of passion, but out of wounded pride, and pride, once spent, leaves nothing to defend. As they left the church, the wind rustled through the yew trees, scattering the last brown leaves along the path. Miss Marple paused at the gate, her eyes on the horizon where the London road curved away into mist. Somewhere out there, Larry Baker was running from a crime he hadn't committed, and she hoped, with a sigh, that he would wait just long enough for the truth to catch him instead. By late afternoon, the clouds had thickened again, and the wind coming off the downs smelled of rain. Miss Marple and Inspector Graves walked the narrow lane toward the Hargreaves' house, both silent, each turning over the same uneasy thought. They had found the ledger in the church, an unshakable piece of evidence, but its existence posed as many questions as it answered. Graves kept glancing at the folded letter in his pocket, as though hoping it might explain itself if he looked often enough. When they reached the gate, the house loomed pale behind its laurels, its windows shuttered, its gravel drive unswept since the night of the bonfire. A faint light burned behind the drawing-room curtains. Graves motioned for quiet and knocked once, firmly. It was Mrs. Hargreaves who opened the door. She was composed as ever, dressed in black silk, though mourning had not yet been officially declared. "Inspector." "I wondered when you would come," she said, her voice steady, her eyes bright and cold. Graves stepped inside, hat in hand. "We'd like to ask a few more questions, madam, about your husband's accounts and about a certain ledger found this morning in Luke's." She smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth trembling just enough to betray the strain. "Of course, though I fail to see what more there is to discuss. My husband's affairs are concluded, tragically concluded." Miss Marple regarded her gently. "Conclusions are, like knots, Mrs. Hargreaves. They appear tidy until one finds the loose end." Something flickered behind the woman's eyes, a tiny, involuntary tremor. She gestured toward the sitting room. "If you must." The room was warm, almost oppressively so. The fire burned high, though the day was not cold enough to need it. The faint scent of lavender polish and brandy mingled in the air. Graves set the ledger on the table. "Your husband kept this hidden," he said. "It contains the parish accounts. Several discrepancies, funds unaccounted for, checks made out in your handwriting." Her chin lifted. "I managed his correspondence. My husband found figures tedious. He signed what I placed before him, as any sensible man would." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, taking in the careful order of the room, the flowers arranged symmetrically, the mantel clock ticking with military precision. "So it was you who saw the letters addressed to him? Then? The anonymous ones?" "I opened them. Yes. It is a wife's duty to protect her husband from worry." Graves watched her closely. "And when he discovered the shortage, he meant to confess, didn't he? The night of the bonfire he intended to speak publicly, clear his name. But that would have meant exposing you." Her fingers tightened on the edge of the chair. "You have no proof of that. Baker's letter suggests you knew far more than you've admitted. He claims you paid him to keep quiet." A flush rose to her cheeks. "That man is a fool and a liar. He'd have blackmailed anyone if it suited him." Miss Marple set down her handbag and folded her hands in her lap. "Mr. Baker may be many things, my dear, but not foolish. He loved this village too much to see it shamed. I think he came to you that night to beg for honesty, and you agreed on the condition that he help you find your husband before the lighting. But something went wrong, didn't it? Alfred quarreled with you again, perhaps struck you, and in that instant, the notion of saving his pride turned into something else entirely." The silence was long. Outside, the rain began to tap against the windows. Mrs. Hargreaves's voice, when it came, was low and precise. "He laughed at me, said I was the real thief, that I'd used his name to play benefactress. All those donations, the tea services, the flower fund, they were mine, not his. He said he'd tell them all. I only meant to stop him shouting. I didn't know the iron poker would—" She broke off, pressing a hand to her mouth. Graves stepped forward, his expression a mixture of duty and pity. "You struck him, then hid him in the bonfire. Baker found the body afterward and assumed he'd caused the death. That's how you meant it to look." Her composure fractured. "I didn't mean for him to burn," she whispered. "I thought someone would see, pull him out before the lighting. But the crowd cheered, and the fire caught so fast." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "We rarely foresee the full consequence of our own deceit. It tends to burn far brighter than we intend." Graves nodded to the constable, waiting at the door. "You'd best come with us, Mrs. Hargreaves." The woman stood, straightening her jacket with trembling hands. "I suppose it's a relief," she said quietly. Keeping it neat was exhausting. When she was gone, the inspector stared into the fire, then turned to Miss Marple. "How did you know?" She smiled faintly. "It was the symmetry, Inspector. Everything in her life was arranged: her home, her husband's reputation, even her grief. But real sorrow is untidy. The only thing she couldn't organize was her conscience." Outside, the rain had softened to a mist. They walked back toward the green. The world washed clean again, save for the dark shape of the burned-out bonfire. Children's voices echoed faintly from the lane beyond, life returning, cautious but persistent. Graves stopped, gazing at the ashes. "Strange thing," he said. "All this fuss over stolen pounds and letters. In the end, it comes down to pride. Always pride," Miss Marple said softly. "The oldest of motives and the hardest to spot. It hides behind virtue, very neatly folded." They parted at the crossroads. Miss Marple walked on alone to her cottage, where Wellington waited by the fire, tail curled neatly about his paws. She hung her coat, set her wet shoes by the hearth, and stood watching the flames. The village would gossip, of course. They always did. But in a week or two, bonfire night would be spoken of again with forced cheer, and new scandals would replace the old. Human nature, she reflected, was as predictable as the seasons, capable of cruelty, but always yearning for comfort once the smoke cleared. She settled into her chair, picked up her knitting, and smiled faintly to herself. "Such a dreadful waste of good kindling," she murmured. "And yet, perhaps, the only fire that ever truly cleanses is the one we light within our own hearts." The clock chimed the hour, steady and precise, and outside, little Brenton exhaled into quiet once more. It was 2 mornings later when the quiet of little Brenton began to settle again, though not without the residue of scandal. The villagers, ever eager to restore a sense of order, spoke of Mrs. Hargreaves's arrest as though it had happened years ago. Some pitied her. Others whispered that she had always been too grand for her station. The vicar prayed for her soul during morning service, and Mrs. Price Ridley remarked that it was quite dreadful, but at least the parish accounts will be properly managed now. Yet beneath the surface calm, something uneasy stirred. Miss Marple noticed it in small things: the way the milkman no longer whistled, the way the grocer stopped talking when she entered, the glances exchanged between the younger men in the pub. She knew that gossip, like embers, never truly died. It smouldered until stirred by the right gust of wind. And there was one gust yet to come. She felt sure of it. For though Mrs. Hargreaves had confessed, the manner of her confession had left a faint dissonance in Miss Marple's mind. There was something incomplete in her account, something that did not ring entirely true. Inspector Graves had seemed content enough. He'd escorted Mrs. Hargreaves to the station with solemn efficiency, filed his report, and accepted the gratitude of the county constabulary. But when Miss Marple called upon him that afternoon, he was less triumphant than she expected. His office in the memorial hall was still cluttered with notes, and the evidence box sat open on the table. He looked up as she entered, rubbing his chin. "I'll admit, ma'am," he said, "this business doesn't sit quite right. The coroner's report came in this morning. Cause of death was blunt force to the head, yes, but there were traces of soot in the lungs. Means Hargreaves was alive when the fire started. Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly, though not in surprise. So she struck him, left him unconscious, and the fire finished the deed. That is what she claimed, after all. Yes, but look here. He handed her the report. The blow wasn't hard enough to kill or even render him senseless for long. The doctor says he'd have come round within minutes, and his right hand showed defensive bruising knuckles split, like he'd fought back. There's no mention of that in her story. Miss Marple studied the paper in silence, then placed it gently on the desk. No, she said softly, because she didn't see him fight back. Graves frowned. Meaning? Meaning, she replied, that by the time he raised that hand, she was already gone. The inspector leaned back. Then who? Miss Marple smiled faintly. We've been assuming that Mrs. Hargreaves was the only one who wished him harm. But there's another person whose story we accepted too readily. Someone who appeared frightened, remorseful, and therefore harmless. Elise Carter, he muttered. Exactly, Miss Marple said. A girl clever enough to forge a few letters, bold enough to confront her employer, and frightened enough to hide behind half-truths once things went wrong. She claimed she only struck him lightly with the lantern pole. Perhaps she did. But if she returned later after Mrs. Hargreaves fled, things may have taken a darker turn. Graves straightened, his tone sharp again. You think the girl went back? But why? She'd have known the fire was about to be lit. Panic has strange appetites, Miss Marple murmured. It drives people toward the very thing they wish to escape. I believe she went to make sure he was truly dead or to retrieve something she feared might expose her. The inspector was already reaching for his coat. The post office, he said. She's back there now, under her aunt's supervision. If there's truth to it, we'll have it today. Miss Marple followed him through the damp lanes, her walking stick tapping briskly. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and ash, and the blackened remains of the bonfire still loomed on the green like a grave. When they reached the post office, Elsie's aunt opened the door nervously, wiping her hands on her apron. She's inside, sir, the woman said. Hasn't been herself since that night. Sits there sorting letters that'll never go. Elsie was behind the counter, pale and hollow-eyed, her fingers trembling as she handled the envelopes. When she saw them, her face blanched. You've come about Mrs. Hargreaves, haven't you? I told you everything. I'm afraid not quite everything, Miss Marple said kindly. There's one matter still unclear. You said you dropped your lantern when you ran from the fire. Where did it fall, my dear? Elsie hesitated. By the cider stall, I think. Graves stepped forward. No, Miss Carter. We found the pole behind the bonfire, bent and blackened. That's not where you said it was. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. You went back, didn't you, after Mrs. Hargreaves struck him? You saw her leave, and when he stirred, when he tried to stand, you panicked. The girl shook her head wildly. He grabbed me. I thought, oh, God. I thought he'd kill me. He said he'd see me ruined. I only pushed him, he fell against the woodpile. I never meant for the fire to. Her voice broke into sobs. Graves exchanged a grim glance with Miss Marple. You stayed long enough to make sure, didn't you? He said quietly. Long enough to see the crowd coming. Elsie covered her face with her hands. I thought no one would know. Mrs. Hargreaves already hated him. Everyone blamed Dennis, and Larry, poor Larry, he'd take the rest on his back like he always did. Miss Marple sighed softly. You might have spared 3 souls instead of 1, my dear, had you only told the truth. By evening, the village was buzzing again, first whispers, then open talk. The tale grew as it travelled, twisting through cottages and tea shops until even the vicar's wife confessed she no longer knew who had killed whom. But Inspector Graves, in his report, wrote it plainly. That Alfred Hargreaves had been struck twice, once by his wife, and again fatally by the postmistress, Elsie Carter. The first blow out of pride, the second out of fear. Miss Marple sat by her window that night, the rain whispering against the panes. The world outside seemed clean again, though she knew it was only an illusion. Wellington purred on her lap as she gazed into the small fire, its embers glowing faintly red. "It's always the same," she murmured. "People think evil arrives grandly, guns, daggers, villains in masks. But it comes quietly, with trembling hands and foolish hearts. Pride, fear, and love, those are the real weapons." She watched the last flame flicker down to ash. The bonfire on the green had been doused days ago, but its reflection still lived in the eyes of everyone who had seen it burn. In time, it would fade, as all tragedies do, yet its smoke would linger in memory, thin, acrid, and impossible to forget. And somewhere beyond the quiet village, dawn began to rise, cool and pale, touching the rooftops of Little Brenton with the promise of forgiveness that only morning ever dares to give. The following day broke grey and still, the kind of morning when the village seemed to hold its breath. Little Brenton was quiet again. But it was a fragile quiet, the hush that follows a storm rather than peace restored. The case, as the inspector declared, was closed. Elsie Carter had signed her confession late the previous night, and the coroner's findings would match it soon enough. The villagers, hungry for finality, already spoke of her in tones of weary pity. Yet Miss Marple, seated by her parlour window with her knitting untouched, felt none of the comfort of resolution. Something was wrong, not dramatically wrong, not in the sense of contradiction or missing evidence, but wrong in the rhythm of things. She had listened to enough human stories, in drawing rooms and rectories and garden gates, to recognize when a confession echoed too perfectly what everyone wanted to hear. Elsie's account fit together with mechanical neatness, like a tale rehearsed rather than lived. It lacked the unevenness of truth. Her mind returned to the detail that had unsettled her from the beginning, the watch. Alfred Hargreaves's pocket watch, found near the ashes, so conveniently engraved and half-buried, as though placed for discovery. She had seen the inspector tuck it away in the evidence box, and never thought more of it until now. But who had placed it there? If Elsie's blow had come after Mrs. Hargreaves fled, she could hardly have taken time to arrange such a token. Nor would she have known its significance. It was too deliberate, too composed, the work of someone who understood how symbols carried meaning in a village like Little Brenton. She rose, set her knitting aside, and fetched her shawl. There was one more call to be made before she could rest. The churchyard was damp beneath her feet, the air sharp with the scent of fallen leaves and distant smoke. The bonfire's remains had finally been cleared, leaving behind only a patch of scorched grass. She paused there, gazing at the emptiness, then walked on toward the vicarage. The Reverend Anstruther was in his study, poring over papers. He looked up, blinking behind his spectacles, as she entered. "Miss Marple, you'll forgive the disorder. I've been trying to reconcile the parish accounts since poor Alfred's incident." "Ah, the accounts," she said gently. "An unending task, I imagine. But tell me, dear Reverend, who usually handles the church funds? You or the treasurer?" "Well, I sign off, of course, but Mrs. Hargreaves kept the ledgers in order. She was invaluable at committee meetings, meticulous, dependable." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, and she would have known then precisely how much the parish owed to the council and to her husband. He looked bewildered. "Owed? My dear lady, the accounts balance perfectly." She smiled faintly. "Yes, they do now." Leaving him perplexed, she continued her walk through the village until she reached the smithy. It stood empty, shuttered since Larry Baker's disappearance, but the door gave easily beneath her hand. Inside, the air smelled of oil and dust. She took a few cautious steps, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The tools hung neatly, just as he had left them, each one cleaned and placed with the precision of a man who liked the world orderly. But near the workbench, Half hidden beneath a cloth, she found a small wooden box. Inside lay a handful of trinkets, a pipe, a pair of cufflinks, and, gleaming faintly in the gloom, a second pocket watch. Miss Marple lifted it carefully. The casing was scratched, the engraving partly rubbed away but not unreadable. A.H. The twin of the one found in the ashes, but older, tarnished by years of use. She understood at once. Larry had kept the real watch. The other, the polished replacement, had been planted, and that could only mean someone had wanted to fix the identity of the body beyond question, to make sure no doubt remained that it was Alfred Hargreaves who had died. But what if it wasn't? The thought struck like a spark. She remembered how little had remained of the corpse, how quick everyone had been to assume. A ring, a watch, a boot, enough to satisfy the village, but hardly enough to satisfy truth. She turned the watch over again, and her breath caught. Inside the lid, faintly etched, were the initials L.B. Larry Baker, the man who had vanished. When she reached the memorial hall, Inspector Graves was just emerging from his office, hat in hand. He stopped short at the sight of her expression. "Good heavens, Miss Marple, what now?" She held out the watch. "This was in Mr. Baker's smithy. I believe the man who burned in that bonfire was not Alfred Hargreaves at all." He stared at her, then shook his head. "Impossible. We had his height, his build, his wife's identification." "His wife's," she repeated softly, "who stood to inherit his estate and who, in her way, arranged the bonfire that made any other identification impossible. What better way to escape disgrace than to disappear in one's own fire?" Graves frowned, then turned pale. "You think Hargreaves is alive?" "I think," Miss Marple said. "He left the village the same night Larry Baker vanished and took Baker's body with him, quite literally, as his disguise. The watch, the boot, the ring, all substituted after the fact. Mrs. Hargreaves confessed to striking him. Yes, but she may have struck a man who wished to vanish, not die. The injuries, the soot in the lungs, they belong to someone else." The inspector's voice dropped. "Good Lord, but why would she lie?" "Because she believed it herself," Miss Marple replied. "He told her of his plan, perhaps to feign his death and start anew, and she, in her fury, struck him. But when she found the fire already ablaze and a body inside, she assumed she'd killed him. She didn't dare question it, and he, meanwhile, slipped away into the night with enough money from the parish funds to live comfortably elsewhere. They hurried together to the Hargreaves' house, where the constable still stood watch. The desk drawers were empty. In the wardrobe, only a few dresses remained. The men's clothes were gone. Miss Marple opened the bureau and found, at the very back, a half-finished letter addressed to no one. "Forgive me, Cynthia. You'll have peace now, and I'll have mine." Graves folded it carefully. "We'll send word to the railway stations. He can't have gone far." Miss Marple gazed toward the window, where the rain had begun again, fine and ceaseless. "He's gone farther than you think, Inspector. Men like Mr. Hargreaves always do. They live on borrowed names and clever disappearances until their pride catches up with them. It always does." Outside, the village bell tolled for the evening service. As they stepped back into the lane, Miss Marple paused at the edge of the green. The grass had begun to grow again over the scorched earth, faint green threads pushing through the black. She smiled faintly, more wistful than triumphant. "In time," she said softly. "The truth always grows where the fire was." The inspector glanced at her, half smiling, himself. "You've a strange comfort in these things, Miss Marple." "Not comfort," she said. "Only understanding. People burn what they can't face, Inspector, but ashes have a curious habit of revealing more than flames ever hide." And as the rain whispered through the leaves and the last smoke of bonfire night drifted from memory, Miss Marple turned toward home, her thoughts quiet at last, her small figure fading into the silver mist that had witnessed it all.